My name is Scott Challoner, and you are listening to the Leaders Council podcast for the people who run the country and the people who keep the country running. As regular listeners of our programme will know very well, part of our mission here at the Leaders Council is to bring you a variety of distinct perspectives on leadership. And to this end, it is my delight to be joined by Dr. Arthur Krebbers on today's programme. Dr. Krebbers is the head of corporate climate and ESG capital markets at NatWest, and part of his role involves publishing research in a range of ESG trends, such as sustainable treasury strategies and the green halo effect. Arthur, very warm welcome to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Scott, for having me. Look forward to the discussion.
Likewise, I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have on the show today. But just to start, for the listeners that might not be familiar with yourself and your role, I've obviously given a very brief outline of what it is that you do. But what is it that you specialise in your own words, please?
Absolutely. So my role within NatWest is to help our corporate clients embed sustainability within their finance function. And that could be very day-to-day things like thinking about how they manage their cash, thinking about their suppliers, thinking about the kind of metrics that they're targeting. But it can also be larger things like a major financing exercise that has a sustainability component.
Yeah, and when we talk about sustainable finance at large, just for, again, people tuning in that may not be familiar with the whole topic, what actually is the definition of sustainable finance in simple terms?
I guess every person who's filled you ask will have a slightly different perspective on that. In my mind, the key thing is the realization that every financial decision has a sustainability impact. And for me, that is sustainable finance. And that realization has led to a whole raft of financial instruments that make that connection very, very explicit. And in my mind, what's been going on that's really exciting within the financial arena in the UK and beyond is this revolution whereby every person that's involved in how finance moves around is starting to have their responsibilities expanded so that they're not just thinking about the narrow financial gain or loss, but also the impact that money is having climate and more broadly on achieving sustainability objectives.
And when we think about the finance sector, why actually is it so crucial to addressing the climate crisis, do you think?
It's a great question. Well, I think there's 2 points. I think one, to deal with the climate change emergency, to deal with a lot of other challenges that we're facing as a society requires substantial investments. And hence it requires channeling of money from organizations like pension funds, like insurers that are looking to invest money, to organizations that are best placed to help deal with those sustainability challenges. There's estimates here that just thinking about the climate investments that are needed in the next 30 years will require us to raise between $100 to $150 trillion equivalent. So there's a lot of money that is needed. So that's one part. And then the other part is this knock-on effect. If you're able to get large financial institutions like banks, like fund managers, to really take sustainability seriously, that has a knock-on effect on all of our clients, right? All the clients we invest in, all the clients we lend to. I think those 2 reasons are critical.
Absolutely. And just for those business leaders that might be tuning into this program today and they're thinking about, their environmental, social, corporate governance, what actually makes a good ESG policy? What are the hallmarks of one?
Absolutely. I think there's various elements to that. I think the first part is making sure that your ESG policy is really well aligned with the most sustainable, most material ESG topics facing your corporate and indeed your sector. The challenge, I think, for a lot of managers has been that ESG has become a little bit of an alphabet soup. Right? There are thousands of different metrics, initiatives, data points that you may look at as a company. But trying to take it back to that 80-20 rule, Pareto principle, what are the core things the core sustainability items that are really relevant for my sector. I mean, it may be, for instance, that water management isn't as relevant for your company because all the water you manage is through the employee bathrooms, or maybe actually water management is very critical because you're, for instance, a beverage company. So that part is key. I think the second part is making sure it remains iterative. I mean, this misconception that ESG is set in stone, that your priorities today will have to be your priorities 5 years from now. And there has to be a realization that it will iterate and being open to feedback from your key stakeholders, be that your suppliers, your customers, your investors, is important there. And the final piece is being very transparent about the policy and making sure it is externally reviewed. It's not just your words people take for it, but you've had a credible external party who's looked at all the metrics, who's looked at the policy, and has given their stamp of approval.
Yeah, certainly makes sense from my perspective. And when it comes to sort of translating those policies into sort of everyday sort of treasury or finance best practices for businesses, how can we sort of, practically apply ESG into sort of our day-to-day operations, do you think?
Sure. So when it comes to treasury teams, I mean, when I started working in this space 10 years ago, these conversations were quite one-dimensional. Should I do a green loan or not? It was very focused on a particular product. But what's been taking place in the last 4 or 5 years with treasury teams has been a much more holistic appreciation of this topic. So we prefer speaking about sustainable treasury best practices. So for all of the work streams that I'm responsible for as a treasurer, how can I overlay those with sustainability? And again, it can be, as I was saying earlier, very simple things like managing my excess cash. Shall I focus on banks with strong ESG credentials? Shall I focus on green deposit products? So it really looking at all those work streams and then realizing that when it comes to ESG technologies that you can consider, if I use that term, there's fundamentally two of them. There's the use of proceeds, so that ensuring that money is directed towards a particular sustainability project. Again, that can work for a loan, a bond, deposit. And then there's this KPI link technology where you link the pricing of the financial instruments, partly to meeting sustainability objectives. And again, we've seen that also work for particular loans, but even for, say, interest rate swaps or more structured products that treasurers engage with. So those two technologies are important to keep in mind, and then looking at all those work streams.
Yeah, and again, certainly makes sense from my perspective, and it's really interesting stuff, isn't it? And obviously, when we think of the green investments that that we can be looking into, sort of because we need to think about obviously sustainable finance. It's essentially also where our money is going. What are the kinds of projects that we do see investment going in if it's going to be green investments?
Well, it's become a very, very broad church in terms of green investments. So that there are investments that are you consider a little bit more mundane in terms of retrofits within buildings, including insulation, including the lighting, etc. So there's those elements. You're very quite invested technologies, very clear what the energy savings are, etc. And then increasingly, the space is moving towards newer, less tested technologies. If you think about green hydrogen, if you think about carbon capture, if you think about the role of also data and technology in helping us optimize our energy usage. When I think about green investments, I think about investments that have a financial return, and also this green return or a green alpha. You can't always fully estimate it, but that in my mind is something you need to bear in mind. What am I expecting financial compensation, and what am I expecting in terms of a CO2 or an environmental improvement? So those two elements.
Yeah, those are the key things, aren't they? It's because when we think about sort of investment into sort of green projects, sourcing materials that have been sort of made in a sustainable way, it tends to be at the moment more expensive, doesn't it? So it's balancing kind of the financial side of it out with essentially offsetting the carbon emissions, isn't it? And I suppose that can be a little bit of a challenge, can't it?
Absolutely, particularly in today's cost of living situation. I think it's a really fair point. There is increasing evidence that consumers and indeed some of the newer on the investor side and the impact funds are taking a little bit more of a balanced view when it comes to both the cost component and the environmental impact component. But you're absolutely right that that's something that you always need to balance, because ultimately it's not sustainable if your organization defaults. So you do need to also make sure that the bottom line is looked after.
Yeah, absolutely right. And speaking of sort of bottom lines as well, we often hear talk of the green economy and how it's going to sort of create more jobs. Is there real evidence that that is going to be the case and that society and the economy will benefit as well as the planet? And the reason I say that is because when we talk about it in that context, it seems to be very much sort of centered around just green energy, doesn't it? It's about sort of building wind farms. We'll need people to build the wind farms. We'll need people to maintain, obviously, these new renewable energy resources. But I suppose the green economy goes just beyond the energy sector, doesn't it?
It's a really valid point, and in my mind, it is very telling that the government a couple of years ago unveiled what they call their green industrial revolution, and I think that's a really telling word. Right, it's thinking about the whole breadth of the real economy and how every sector, including ones that currently are very carbon intensive, can transition, can develop new services, new products. That are energy and carbon efficient and in due course energy and carbon neutral, and undoubtedly that will create different types of human capital requirements. Now, the area of increasing focus is, okay, but in the meantime, how do we support people in preparing themselves for that labor market? Because clearly people are trained up to deal with, say, more fossil fuel focused energy generation, and that may not immediately translate into the right skill set for a wind or solar related job. So hence, what we have seen is this concept of a just transition has really grown in importance. So yes, we want to get carbon neutral for our country, for the companies in the country. But how do we support people that we maintain, the societal buy-in for that agenda?
Exactly right. And obviously a part of that is going to essentially be addressing what's going to be a new skills gap. I mean, we already see a lot of different skill shortages in different sectors of UK industry, but we do need people trained up to, deal with these new sort of carbon neutral technologies. So, like I say, education and the government and also industry, they've all got to come together. All stakeholders really need to be collaborating very strongly to really make sure we deliver on that. Absolutely.
No, that's really well put, and that's one of the elements of my role that is amongst others that is very satisfying, is that it is about collaboration, and a lot of the work that I do is indeed collaborating with clients, collaborating with other banks, with other stakeholders to come together to develop new financial products, financial initiatives that can help us. I mean, I think there's a realization that this cannot be achieved by any organization or indeed any part of the economy in a silo.
Exactly right. And something I do want to talk about as well whilst we're on the programme is something called the green halo effect. And this is this idea that businesses are wising up to, sort of ESG and operating more green because consumers tend to be drawn towards businesses that are more eco-friendly and towards products that are sourced in a sustainable way. So do you feel from your personal experience that rings true and the green halo effect is very much a real and alive and well thing?
Having a green product is certainly now, and indeed a green strategy, is increasingly moving towards being a must-have for all sectors in the real economy. And when we survey CFOs on the topic, they're very clear that it's now hence a key part of their equity and their credit story, because they risk otherwise, regardless of their own personal views on some of those products, they risk being left behind in terms of their competitive position. And it hopefully becomes a race to the top, right? Because you roll out a new product range, and typically your competitors follow, so you have to keep improving. And there is indeed evidence strongly suggesting that certain customer segments, particularly the millennial, the Gen Z generations, display much more brand loyalty to companies with a credible, sustainable product range. And with what's happening in sort of entrepreneurship and sort of early stage companies, an increasing number of them are trying to also stimulate innovation in this area.
They are, exactly. People are really wising up to the urgency of the situation. And I think we've certainly seen that more since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason I say that is because since then, I think we've become far more aware of our own mortality, but also our own carbon footprint and the impact that we are having on the planet. And do you feel that since COVID, we've actually seen more of a shift toward, doing things greener, so buying greener products, investing more green?
Absolutely. I think COVID, as you well put, has highlighted two elements of ESG very well. Indeed, there's the carbon component, right? Where we suddenly got habitualized and some would say forced into greener behavior because we couldn't sort of take the plane every week, and we have to make certain personal adjustments, for instance, in that way. And I think that habitualization will to an extent continue, right? People will have become a little bit more conscious about, like you say there, the impact on the planet. But then the other main part of COVID and how companies have been responding to it is indeed the social part. So the responsibility that companies have towards employees, towards their communities, towards their supply chain. So that element is related, and I think it's important that when we do talk about those elements, right, environmental and social, we really have to see them as being quite closely connected. Because ultimately, climate change would be a major societal disaster. So that concept of climate change, justice, etc., is also important.
Yeah, of course. And it's not just consumer habits that are changing either, is it? I suppose it's also people's individual priorities. And something happened, of course, during the onset of COVID, which was called sort of the Great Resignation, wasn't there? Where a lot of people moved out of the roles that they were in and into different industries. And there is some evidence out there that suggests that more candidates are starting to turn to companies to go and work where there are, robust CSR and ESG policies because, they want the business they're working for. They want their employer to be championing the things that they care about. So do you feel sort of from your experience that does ring true and more people are sort of conscious of this when they're putting themselves forward for job roles? And then business leaders therefore have to be very, very aware of that, because if you're not a company that's thinking about decarbonising, that's thinking about operating sustainably, you're going to miss out on what is a shrinking pool of talent in a time where recruitment is actually quite difficult.
I think that is very true, and we found that also within the banking industry, where perhaps 10, 15 years ago, the questions we would get from prospective graduates and then junior staff would perhaps be centered on do you have a mergers and acquisitions team, do you have an equity trading team, that's certain perceived very attractive roles. The now questions about the sustainability strategy and ethos of the bank becoming quite central to their decision to join that employer, and I think also while that's happening at that part of the the labour market. We're also starting to see it also with more and more senior managerial staff. We see people thinking about what kind of planet do I want to leave to my children, to my grandchildren, and being proud to work for companies that do take that into account. And again, almost regardless of sector. So it is that I guess softer association perhaps, but it's turning into a real recruitment differentiating point and indeed retention.
It is exactly right, and something that businesses do need to be really, really careful about, therefore, in this regard, is falling victim to greenwashing. And that's something, of course, where, something has the air of being sustainable, but it isn't necessarily sustainable at all. And say, for instance, you sort of have a laptop that you're selling that, is made from sustainably sourced products, and you're sort of pushing it forward as a sustainable product, but then you've not taken into account the carbon emissions from having to transport that stock into the store that you're selling it from, or the emissions for sort of transporting the components. So it's all those things that are sort of baked into the whole kind of supply chain process that need to be considered, and that can be how companies sort of fall into the greenwashing trap. So, I've obviously named one example there, but for you, are there any other common examples of greenwashing that you sort of see day to day within businesses?
Yeah, greenwashing is an interesting point because certainly in the financial industry, it's one where regulators are increasingly focused on how it may arise and what that does to consumers and to investors. And I think the laptop example you gave there is quite interesting because it highlights one of the things that we see as being a tenet of greenwashing, and that is that it's displayed through very selective disclosure, so only highlighting a few elements of a product or indeed of an entire company, but not necessarily, back to my earlier point, the most material ESG metrics or elements. So very selective disclosure. Or it's also characterized by very superficial messages and statements and not necessarily backing them up with calculations, with relevant detail, with proof points. So a little bit of window dressing. We often see it as well when claims have not been subjected to the proper external review or proper external standard, whether it's kind of just backed up by the company themselves and it doesn't have that external validation. Now, clearly there's obvious ways of dealing with that, and I think one of the ones that I would want to recommend is ongoing engagement with stakeholders about your products and services. Again, be that consumers, be that suppliers, be that your investors. Again, what are their ESG priorities and other products or services that you're hoping to roll out? Are they in alignment? Are they seen to be credible by those stakeholders?
Exactly right, and that's how obviously we can look to kind of address the issue of greenwashing. We make sure that the communication is consistent with all stakeholders, and any particular sort of little loopholes are always picked up on and addressed. But if obviously you are found as a business to have kind of slipped into the greenwashing trap, how important is it that you address it? Because it's like, there are some ways that you're going to lose out. I'm not suggesting that you might be penalised for it, but investors could potentially, who are sort of very sort of eco-friendly inclined, may well sort of pull out. They might obviously be unimpressed by what they're seeing. So there are lots and lots of ways that businesses could really struggle if they do fall into the trap.
Oh, absolutely. When it comes to greenwashing, when it comes to more broadly ESG controversies, investors in particular do have a long memory. And if you look at, for instance, some of the ESG rating methodologies, it's not unusual for those elements to be picked up even 3, 4, 5 years for their actual occurrence. So being very transparent, being very proactive in dealing with the issue is absolutely paramount to help your stakeholders turn to a new chapter and look forward. And it has been done. If you look at companies who have had such issues in the past 5 to 10 years, Some of them now are amongst the ESG leaders of their industry because they've taken that challenge and that problem, and they've turned it into an actual opportunity to rethink and restructure their business and their corporate ethos.
And that's a good way to approach it, isn't it? I think when we sort of suffer the setback of maybe we fall into a little bit of an ESG trap, as it were, we don't want to sort of essentially make that a terminal failure or a significant setback. We can use that as an impetus to actually bounce back, review things and really move forward. And as you say, I mean, so many businesses have really addressed the issue as and where they've seen it, and they've been able to turn things around.
Absolutely. That's exactly the right way to look at this. And I would add as well that, not letting, when it comes to your ESG improvements, not letting perfect be the enemy of good. I have been working with a number of companies in some cases where they want to launch a new ESG strategy or a new ESG financial instrument, but because they're trying to achieve perfection, they're spending sometimes years trying to finesse it, and that clearly means that there's no actual real progress at the company because it's still debating what progress should be. So also be very careful about that trap. As I said earlier, it is iterative because expectations are evolving, ESG standards are evolving, what the competitors are doing is evolving as well. So it will be iterative and it will be subject to continued change. And I think one thing perhaps worth adding as well, it was for me a bit of an eye-opener when I was into my first sustainability project. It helps break down a lot of silos within companies. So you suddenly, particularly the stuff that I work on, you suddenly have a treasurer speaking with a CSR lead, speaking with some of the actual project managers, speaking with other parts of the business. And these are often quite siloed, the larger organizations, parts of the business. But sustainability can create this really interesting collaboration across those functions.
And that can only be beneficial, can't it? Sort of opening the communication channels in that way. And I think you were absolutely right in what you said about the rate of change, because things are in a constant state of flux, aren't they? And so I think it's wrong to almost approach implementing kind of a robust CSR or ESG policy like all at once. I mean, you've got to be taking steps sort of almost by the day, haven't you? It's little things at once, little bits of progress, and then keep building on that rather than sort of introduce one all-encompassing strategy all at once.
Absolutely right. And through engagement, you can finesse that strategy, and you can also consider what are the right short to medium term goals for that strategy. Because again, there's often this misconception that ESG is about where you get to in 2050 or 2040. A lot of companies have made some of those statements and some of those ambitions, but then when you speak to investors, when you speak to stakeholders, they also want to know, what is the current management going to try to achieve in the next 3, 4, 5 years? And how is that consistent with that longer term trajectory? And of course, you understand that particularly in today's economic environment, it's not a hard science, and you may need to change, you may need to course correct. You want to have a sense where you're heading, within your tenure within the company.
Yeah, it's amazing what can actually be achieved in a short space of time. I mean, there are plenty of businesses out there at the moment that already say they are carbon neutral, and hopefully that is going to be a positive example for those in the future as well. And just talking about the future, actually, Arthur, before we finish up, I do want to talk about what sort of your personal sort of goals and ambitions are going to be over the next 12 months as we continue to look at these projects, because it's important in the context of the current climate, because there's a lot of urgency around shoring up the UK's energy security, and understandably so. But when we're hearing talk of more, North Sea oil and gas licenses going out, for instance, the key thing is we don't want that to sort of come at the detriment of the longer term goal, do we, of bringing those emissions down?
Absolutely. The current energy market crisis that we are facing clearly requires immediate short-term responses, but that we shouldn't lose sight of where we need to be in the medium to longer term. And as you said, it in many ways highlights the importance of having a robust, locally, nationally generated energy system. And in terms of my own goals, I mean, there's a number of North Stars that guide me. I think one is maintaining a broad church behind the ESG. I am concerned about polarization within the UK, more internationally as well, and what that could do to the need for collaboration between different industries, between different stakeholders. So how do we maintain that, and what role can I and NatWest play in facilitating that? And then my other ongoing goal is, when dealing with people that make financial decisions, shifting the dial around how they think about ESG. That it's not a why should I bother, why should I do the green financial instrument, to why not? Again, a mindset shift, and that's happening in more and more sectors. And then linked to that, getting to a place, particularly with our investor clients, where ESG becomes business as usual. So when they look at an investment opportunity, they look at financial returns, the immediate risks, carbon impact, social impact, as some examples, that it becomes part of their holistic way of calculating their returns, not some sort of sideshow or incidental system.
So plenty to get your teeth stuck into, Arthur, and I think it would be fantastic maybe at some point in the coming months over the next year if we could even catch up and just see sort of what kind of green projects sprouts up in the meantime, and we see sort of what progress we've made on that. But for now, it's a shame that we're just about out of time on the show, because it's been thoroughly brilliant having you join us to talk everything sustainable finance. And do take care, Arthur, and enjoy obviously the upcoming weekend as well. We're recording this episode on a Friday, so the weekend is ahead of us, and really do appreciate your time on this. It's been fantastic.
Thank you very much, Scott. I've very much enjoyed the conversation and look forward to the next one.
Yes, absolutely. It would be fantastic to welcome Dr. Arthur Krebbers back onto the show in future. And I'm sure the rest of the listeners tuning into this also share that sentiment. And again, do hope you certainly enjoyed the conversation today. And just a reminder to all listening in, if you do feel you have your own contribution to make to this discussion, or you wish even to bring your own topical matter or issue to the discussion table, then you too can apply to be on the Leaders Council podcast via leaderscouncil.co.uk/apply. As always, I've been your host, Scott on today's episode. It's been fantastic to have my guest, Dr. Arthur Krebbers from NatWest, on the show as well. And to all tuning in, please take care, enjoy your weekends, and goodbye.